I'm Vishnu Palayandran. I am a senior software engineer at BizTalk 360. So I've been working with BizTalk 360 for 2 years now. My major contributions to BizTalk 360 in the area of analytics. So it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Kent Weare. Kent has been working in the area of energy sector for past 9 years. He's passionate about integration and very active in technology communities. He has recently co-authored 3 books about BizTalk and can be found giving speeches at technology events in Canada, United States, and Europe. He has been recognized for these efforts by Microsoft as most valuable professional for last 8 years. Today, he's going to talk about Give Your Bots connectivity with Azure Logic Apps. Please welcome Kent onto the stage.
All right, good afternoon. Hope everyone's energized. Haven't had too many carbs, but we'll try to keep this interesting and keep the show moving. So, as mentioned, my name's Kent Weare. I'm from Calgary, Canada. This is the 4th time I had the opportunity to come to London and speak. So very much appreciate coming back. So thank you, BizTalk 360, and thank you to you attendees who keep making this event possible. So today I do want to talk about giving your bots connectivity using Azure Logic Apps. But before we get into that, a brief, bio about myself. So Azure MVP. I also do write for InfoQ. I'm part of Richard Seroter's cloud editorial team. I am an author, as mentioned, and more recently a vlogger. So I've been running a show called Middleware Friday, each Friday, trying to keep a short show around integration and emerging news, and try to keep it light, around 20 minutes. So if you haven't checked that out, I encourage you to do so. You can find that at integrationusergroup.com. I also do blog. There's my blog there. And for the last year or so, I've been a digital asset / currency enthusiast. So certainly if you share that interest, let's chat after. We're going to talk a little bit more actually in one of my demos. So the agenda, what I want to talk about is the evolution of IT and how bots and cognitive services fit into that paradigm. We'll get into what are bots, talk about the hype around bots, and then I've got a couple demos for you based on some use cases that we're using at TransAlta, the organization that I work for. And we'll also give you some insight into how you would go about building a bot. So first off, I want to talk a little bit about transformation. I know it's a heavily loaded term these days, specifically within a lot of the consulting companies, no offense. But I wanted to chat a little bit about our transformation. So TransAlta is a power generation and energy trading commodity shop. We operate in 3 countries, Canada, the United States, and Australia. And we're undergoing some transformation. And I thought it would be interesting to share some of our learnings and what's driving some of this transformation and how we can actually leverage technology to increase the competitiveness of our business, even though we're entering a lot of uncertain times. Now, what's driving this uncertainty is the change around greenhouse gases. And this is in part due to changing governments within Canada and the province of Alberta, where coal-fired power generation is being banned. So it needs to be phased out by 2030 within the province of Alberta, where I live. Now, the challenge with this, as you can see by the chart, is that 41% of our revenue comes from this source. So you can kind of see this as a bit of a burning platform or as an opportunity to sort of change the way your company operates in order to remain competitive and to continue to exist. You look at some of those case studies around Kodak, where perhaps they weren't trying to see what's coming at them. And as a result, it created a lot of challenges for them. So one of the things that we've been doing for the past year is trying to ensure that the rest of our business units remain competitive and they have access to cutting-edge technology and services that allow them to grow. Now, the problem is historically you tend to get into these fixed refresh cycles around infrastructure. And that's represented by the left column here, where you go through and every 3 to 5 years you go out and you provision a big V block or some sort of converged infrastructure, and you lay down several millions of dollars with the expectation that it's going to last for the next 3 to 5 years. The problem is now, as we see the dynamics of our business changing, this is actually a model that won't work for us. Because the problem is when we go ahead and build for peak, we're now locked into those costs. We've chatted about that we expect our coal revenues to decrease over time, And as a result, we also expect that our renewable footprint increases in time. So the challenge is if we take a lot of these fixed costs and project it onto our renewable business, they actually become less competitive because their cost structure is too high. And that's what's really prompted the next column, which is called Zero Data Center. So this is something that we've embarked for the last year. We've begun this, and the idea is that we're shutting down our Calgary data centers and we're moving all of our workloads to the cloud. And more specifically, in this case, the Microsoft Azure cloud. And at this point, we're probably about 35% complete. And what we've done is we've taken existing workloads and we've moved them into more of this metered or consumption-based model, which now allows our business partners to actually reduce their costs. Previously, we didn't have a lot of levers that they could pull in order to reduce their costs. Now they can. So we can do things like turn the workload off on weekends if we don't need it. We can schedule all dev tests to be shut down every night. And even in some production systems, we actually can use the cloud and the elasticity in order to drive those characteristics of the system. So for example, we've got a billing system that runs twice a month. So we only run it for 2 days and we shut it down for the remaining 28 or 29 days. Similarly, on our energy trading side, we have applications that need to burst at night. If they need to go ahead and actually evaluate the position of the company, we now can spin up additional application servers and actually only use them for the 5 hours that those jobs run. Then they'll shut down and basically, business as usual. And as part of this journey, automation has become a focus so that we actually can provision these workloads faster and faster. Now, the next pillar is leveraging platforms. And we've heard a lot about platforms today and yesterday, in particular when we talk about serverless. And it's this whole idea that we can use these platforms to accelerate our velocity and reduce the time to delivery. And we've also been very focused on leaning out existing processes and not focusing on busy work, but focusing on work that provides a lot of value. And so when we talk about platforms, these are platforms like Azure, Platform as a Service, like Office 365, Power Apps, Flow, and then certainly other platforms such as ServiceNow. And then lastly, where all of this is leading to is this idea of the last column or the last pillar, which is automating insight. So historically, and we chatted a little bit about this yesterday, this idea that integration was typically in the back end, you were automating transactions, you're reducing a lot of kind of keystrokes, but now the business is actually looking for more. They're actually looking for the ability to automate insight. And that's where a lot of these technologies appear today, like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and bots that actually can help us automate insight and allow the business to scale, but without adding people. And so really, this is the focus of my talk today, and we're going to get into that in more details in future slides. So one of the questions is, so what's changing? Why is this different than any other previous paradigm? I think really the amount of data that's being ingested, so when we talk about big data or IoT, certainly it's contributing to massive amounts of information that's now available, and you need some sort of cost-effective place to actually manage that data, and you can actually do that in the cloud. Last year, I presented on our IoT strategy, and we've made a tremendous amount of progress since then. We're processing more than 4 million events per day in the cloud through our IoT platform. And what this has done is now it's created opportunities on the back end of that. Because ingesting data that's not actionable isn't actually valuable. Once you can action that data, now that actually is game-changing for the business. So moving on to cognitive services, and what exactly are cognitive services? So cognitive services allow you to bring your existing data stores, which can be on-premise or in the cloud. You're allowed to bring your existing algorithms or any of the data science tools and algorithms that are provided, say some R libraries. And on top of that, Microsoft is providing a rich set of APIs for cognitive services. And now the bot framework, which is what we're going to talk about today, it plugs in really nicely with the rest of the cognitive services ecosystem. So when we talk about the cognitive services APIs, they can be grouped into these 5 different categories. So the first one is vision, which allows you to detect faces, feelings, and allow apps to understand your images and video. So we saw an example of this yesterday in Jeff's demo, where he had a Power App, and he was able to authenticate himself by taking a picture of him, and he was allowed to enter the health club. So that's an example of of vision. Then we have speech. So it's the ability for Cortana to hear and understand what someone's trying to say. And next is language, and this is what I'm going to focus on in this talk, and it's the ability to process text and learn to recognize what users want. Also, in the next session, Steph Jan's going to talk a little bit about sentiment analysis, which is one of these other language APIs. So conversational apps or bots. So there's a lot of hype around this, and I think it's for good reason. So this is the Gartner hype cycle. So this is a year old. And what it says is that for both conversational user interfaces and cognitive expert advisors, that Gartner expects it to be mainstream adopted within the next 5 to 10 years. So this is 1 year old, but I would also say that I think that it's accelerated more so than this. I think the fact that we're talking about this today here, that Microsoft and Amazon is talking about these types of technologies, I think that this time frame is getting shorter and shorter. So here's some examples of the hype. So Microsoft CEO, bots are the new apps. One bot to rule them all, not likely, with Apple, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft virtual assistants. And also bots are the new generation of apps. So you might ask, well, why? Why is that the case? I think this slide speaks to that. So this is a little dated, a year old, but still impactful. So Facebook has 1.6 billion users. WhatsApp has over 1 billion users. Skype has over 300 million users. So the question is, when you're building an app, why are you trying to build an app away from where all the attention is? So when you go ahead and build something, say in an app store or a web app, what's actually happening is you're taking your user away from where they want to be. Because clearly, this is where the user wants to be. And I think if we examine your own habits. How many today, show of hands, have used WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, or any other of these, Twitter messaging, Facebook messaging? So I would say probably a good 80% of the room has used these. So, sorry? 1 hand per application. Yeah, there you go, yeah. Now, from an enterprise perspective, what does this mean? So I think there's a bit of an opportunity brewing here, certainly for customers and for partners. And that's this ever-growing Office 365 ecosystem. So recently, Microsoft has announced that there's over 100 million active commercial subscriptions that exist today. Now, what's interesting about that is the introduction of Microsoft Teams. So essentially the Slack competitor that allows teams to collaborate in a very efficient manner and without a whole lot of email. And so we're going to talk a little bit about today about Teams and how we can plug bots into Teams to allow for some frictionless communication. So when I think of bots, I'm thinking more in the context of the enterprise. And here's some of the goals that I foresee in this area. One is reducing friction. So the idea that you're not always alt-tabbing, or perhaps you're not having to go into some of those green screens that we saw yesterday. Another is just to improve productivity and to improve the user experience. At TransAlta, we've been on enterprise voice since 2012, so 5 years. So our users are very accustomed to IMing and actually using their phone, a soft phone. And I think if you ever tried to pull that away from them, there would be a mutiny. Like it would not be a good scene. And I think this allows people to leverage those tools even more so. So the rise of the cognitive assistant. So assistants are being embedded everywhere, and as computing advances, virtual assistants will help with task completion. And I think that's kind of the crux of all of this, is this idea that you can actually issue a very simple command and have this bot basically complete that task on your behalf without adding a whole lot of friction. And so there are many different types of bots. And these are my own definitions, so it's open for discussion. But there's a procedural bot, and we're going to see this today. And it's the idea that you've got a very prescribed menu with little agility for end users. So you don't want them going off the beaten path. And so for an example that we're going to talk about is the idea of a field worker. So someone that's working at a wind farm. We don't want them to think about all of the different kind of combinations that they need to think about in order to issue these commands. We just want it to be very productive and very streamlined. Then we can move over to contextual bots. And these are less rigid, and users have intents and issue utterances. So what that means is they issue statements, and the bot is trying to interpret what the user actually wants to do, and then it will go ahead and do it. And so I've got another example that demonstrates this one, and it's this idea of a trading shop. So like I said, we have an energy trading shop, and we've got traders that actually use IM all day long, and they use it across organizations, and they actually execute trades using IAMs. So doing what I'm about to show you is a very familiar environment for them. And in that case, those people don't want something rigid. They're going to want to come up with their own sort of statements and have the bot automatically interpret it for them. Then if we move over to the right one more, we've got event-driven bots. So it's the ability to subscribe to particular events and have you notified when that event occurs so that you're not constantly probing for the state of a particular, say, transaction. And lastly, we're not going to talk about this today, but I think it's important. A lot of the consulting companies are starting to talk about RPA, or robotic process automation. And I would consider these bots, but I would consider them to be a different flavor of bot, where you've got essentially, macros or sort of screen captures where a system just knows what to do based upon the particular location of a field, and it just gets automated. So you can think about if you've ever used automated testing tools, those would be examples of RPA. But now what we're starting to see, and we've done it ourselves, is to actually use those in production to sort of lean out some of those existing manual processes that exist, where you may not have APIs on the back end that allow you to programmatically execute these different tasks. So let's start getting into more of the details here. So operations bot, why? Why would we want this? And so we don't want technicians spending time in business applications. At a previous organization, we had SAP for work management. Those field directors did not want their people touching SAP in this case. It was just there was too many screens, too many things to remember, and we have to remember that their job as, say, a technician is to fix equipment and getting it up as fast as possible. And granted, from a corporate perspective, yes, you have to capture that data. It needs to be tracked. It needs to be optimized. But we have to focus on what the core competency or the core responsibility of those people are. Same thing with all tabbing. You might have some very user-friendly applications, but if users are all tabbing all day long, that's not overly productive. And I think a growing trend, and this certainly isn't a surprise, especially out in the field where pen and paper is still prevalent, is now the opportunity to enable more mobility solutions through such as things as Power Apps, as we saw yesterday. So there's two scenarios I want to work through today with you in this demo, and it's this idea of an equipment issue. Now, in this case, we're talking not about treadmills like yesterday. We're going to talk about the end user who might be out in the field and has some sort of an issue, an IT issue. Something's wrong with their tablet, and they need to log a ticket. And then we've got this idea of technical change management, or what's referred to as management of change. So you can think of this much like your IT change board, where whenever you're going to make a production change, you have to go represent it, you have to communicate it, it has to be vetted, it has to be validated. Same thing happens in the field, where you have a piece of equipment that you're detecting is about to fail, and you want to go swap that piece of equipment out. You want to ensure that there's some due diligence around that. So here's the architecture of this particular bot. What we have is we've got Microsoft Teams is going to be our chat-based application. And then we've got the Microsoft Bot Service that's sitting up in Azure. And then it's going to be communicating with Azure API Management, or what I'm referring to as my API gateway. And behind this gateway, we've got Azure Logic Apps. And really, this is the connectivity layer. Now, you could argue, well, do I really need Logic Apps in this particular use case? And the answer is no, you probably don't. But I would also say, if you want to actually be very productive and actually develop this application much quicker, you can do so by using Logic Apps. And that's exactly what I've done here, is I've used Logic Apps to basically interact with ServiceNow. I've also used it to talk to SAP, which would be pretty impossible if you wanted to custom write that yourself. So in this case, I've got the on-premise data gateway, and I'm using the SAP connector, and I'm able to now communicate with my on-premise SAP instance in order to get the master data around my plants, the functional locations, and the equipment. And lastly, I've got the MOC system, which is basically going to record these details as you have a field worker out in the field that is actually collecting this data. So I'm going to jump into a demo now. And in this case, so this is Microsoft Teams. For those that aren't familiar with it, it's similar to Slack. You can go ahead and create your different teams, create different channels, and then go ahead and add people to those channels so they can essentially subscribe to that information instead of pushing out a lot of email and kind of duplicating all of this content everywhere. You also have the ability to plug in to the rest of the Microsoft ecosystem. So OneNote, Power BI, Planner, and well, I guess we have a couple planners on that one. So now I'm in the chat, and I'm actually talking to something called the TA operations bot. And to get started with this, I can just go ahead and hit menu. So now the bot service has come back and said, here's the menu. And as I mentioned before, this is one of those bots where it's very prescribed. I'm a field worker. I don't really want to think too much about what's going on. So if I want to go ahead and create a ServiceNow ticket, I can go ahead and either click that button or touch it if I have a touch screen. Next, I'm going to be prompted, is this ticket related to hardware or software? And in this case, it's going to be related to hardware. And so that's a mandatory field. So basically, the bot knows that and is prompting me for that information. Now, from a ticket severity perspective, I think it's super important. I think it's a 6. But now the bot knows that 6 is out of bounds. So I need to put 3 because that's a value that's in range. And the priority is going to be 1. So it's going to go out, and it's going to be talking to Logic Apps. And through Logic Apps, we're going to tap into ServiceNow and create a ticket. So now we can see we have this ticket that ends in 21. So let's go back to our menu, and we can see what open tickets exist for me. So I'm getting prompted to confirm that. So here's all of my tickets, and we can see that 21, sure enough, exists. So let's say I fixed the mouse myself. I want to just go ahead and close this. So I need to provide a ticket number naturally. And I'll just say IT is too slow. I fixed it myself. So now we've got the ticket closed. So I don't know how many of you enjoy talking to service desks, but it's certainly not how I choose to spend my time. So when I think about doing some of this stuff through a bot, I'm all over it. And I'd much rather do it through something like this than having to navigate a bunch of different screens within some sort of SaaS-based tool. So let's go think about the next scenario. And in this case, I'm doing an inspection on a piece of equipment out in the field. I notice that there's a piece of equipment that's wearing. And I need to issue a management of change so that we can go ahead and fix that. So the first thing I want to do, if I'm not sure of the plant I'm at, I need to figure out which plant, what's sort of the master data related to that plant. So I want to include all plants. And then these are all of the plants that have appeared in the system. Now that was pretty quicker than some of the ServiceNow stuff. And the reason for it is one of the value adds of using API management is I can cache different requests. And in this case, our plant data doesn't change often. So why would I go hit that back-end system if I don't have to? It's a great use of actually using Azure API management to go ahead and cache those results, since this data isn't likely to change. Next, I can go and say, you know what are the different functional locations for this plant? And you can think of a functional location much like a hierarchy, where in different parts of the plants you'd have different functional locations, and equipment would then live within a specific functional location. So I need to provide the plant for that functional location. So these are the different functional locations. And lastly, if I want to then see the equipment, I need to provide a functional location. Now, if I know this information already, I don't have to go through those other menus. So it's one of those things where it's there if you need it, but if you don't need it, just shortcut the process. So in this case, I know it's a water pump, but I don't know exactly the type of water pump. So essentially what's going to happen now is we're going to query SAP through the on-premise gateway, through the connector, and actually return the results that match water pump for that functional location within that particular plant. So let's say it is a raw water pump in the house building. So now I'm going to go ahead and I need to issue a notification inside of SAP, which is essentially a flag indicating that there's something wrong with this piece of equipment. And I can go ahead and provide this equipment number. It'll create this notification, and then I can relate this notification number to the management of change in that system. Now, in this case, the bot remembers our conversation. So it actually remembers the notification that I just created and basically has been able to do that linkage on its own without me having to actually type it in that particular situation. So I'm going to speed up a little bit because I'm afraid we're going to be short on time. So I will go through, this will be a little plug for Middleware Friday, but I'm going to go through more detail on Middleware Friday in a future episode. Or feel free to chat with me after as well if you feel I'm moving too quickly here. But I want to give you some insight into what's actually involved in building a bot. So the first thing is there is an SDK. You go ahead and download that, and what that allows you to do is to actually create a new application from a bot application template. Once you actually have that application, you're going to get basically like a skeleton of an actual bot itself. And in this case, you're going to go ahead, much like an ASP.NET MVC application or a web API application, you're going to go ahead and build out your controllers, build out your models or your data entities, and then you can go ahead and build your prompts. And the prompts can be two ways. It can be very prescriptive, as I just showed you, or it can be based more contextually, and we're going to see that in the next demo, based on Lewis. There's a debug experience, and you now have the ability to run an emulator locally, and it's going to go ahead and communicate with your bot that you're basically running inside of Visual Studio. You would go ahead and publish your bot to app service, much like you would a web API or a web app. And then you need to go ahead and register your bot, and you would go ahead and do that inside of the bot framework online. So this is the bot framework service, dev.botframework.com. You need to generate an app ID and a password. And then you would embed that app ID and password in your application, and then you'd have to republish it. Now, the whole idea, you have to republish it, it's kind of this chicken or the egg scenario where you need to be able to provide an endpoint URL when you go ahead and create or register your bot. But at that point, you don't actually have the app ID and app password, so it is a bit of a two-step process. Once you've done that, you have all of these different channels that you can actually expose your app to. In this particular case, I exposed it to Teams. But in my next demo, I've exposed it to Skype, the consumer version of Skype. Once it's confirmed, there is another step that you do need to perform if you're using Teams, and it's this idea that you need to sideload the application, and this is a setting that your Office 365 tenant owner would need to enable. So there's sort of two modes. If you want to keep this private, just within your organization, you go ahead and do this. If this was something that you wanted to make commercially available, then you would actually register it in the service, and you wouldn't actually have to go ahead and do this part. Next, building the Logic app. So there's a few different Logic apps involved in this particular architecture, but this is the one where we go ahead and talk to SAP, and we've got the equipment request. And in this case, we're exposing an HTTP request. I am taking in XML. I'm then going to take that sort of friendly XML and use a transform inside of a map, which is found inside of my integration account. And I'm going to transform it from that friendly web request into a request that SAP understands. I'm going to go ahead and call SAP using the send to SAP operation or action. I'm going to get that SAP response, and I don't want to send back that entire response. I want to have something a little bit more friendly. So I'm going to do a response on the output as well. Next, and we saw a little bit of this yesterday, is the ability to take a Logic app and protect it using Azure API Management. And I can go ahead and do so by logging into Azure API Management and clicking on Logic App. And when I do so, I'm going to just get prompted to browse and select my particular Logic App. And it's going to do all of the nice wiring up of that. So it's going to take care of the token that you need to provide in order to access Logic Apps. And it's going to do a lot of work for you, which streamlines the process. I think once you've done this a few times, it'll take you like 5 minutes. And you've got a working API experience around Logic Apps. Now, once I'm in Azure API Management, I can actually take advantage of other policies. So in this case, there's a few that I'm using. I'm actually using caching, so I can actually cache requests and have a snappier response. I'm also doing XML to JSON. So we chatted before about how we're doing all this XML work inside of the Logic App in order to deal with SAP, but my end client doesn't actually want to deal with XML. It would rather deal with JSON. So then I'm going to use, as an outbound processing policy, I'm going to convert the XML into JSON. Okay, so there's more. And next, we're going to talk about LUIS, which is Language Understanding Intelligence Service. And the idea behind this is you go ahead and you create a model. You then train the model inside of LUIS.ai. You would then go ahead and deploy it, and you get an HTTP endpoint. You would go ahead and make that available to other applications. They would go ahead and use it, and then they'll provide you suggestions that you can actually use to train your model once again. And actually, it will continue to get more intelligent the more you use it. So the scenario I want to use today is around cryptocurrency. And I realize right now it's a horrible time to do that if for any of that's following Bitcoin right now, just because the market's getting beat up pretty good. But there's two dominant currencies today, Bitcoin and Ethereum. And there's exchanges, and you have the ability to interact with those exchanges through APIs. And there's actually a lot of people that are writing bots that integrate with these different exchanges, and they're actually doing a lot of that event processing that I talked about. So based upon different conditions, it's going to start to interact with those exchanges, and there's some people doing some interesting things there. So what I've got here, similarly, I'm going to have traders or investors having the ability to use Skype that's going to interact with the Microsoft bot service, and in turn, we're going to use Logic Apps, once again, as that connectivity layer that's going to allow us to talk to an exchange. Now, in this case, I'm using a real exchange called Quadriga CA, which is out of Vancouver, Canada. Now, I'm only getting the real-time pricing from these guys. I wasn't about to put my own API key into this thing in order to buy and sell. I'm not there yet. So that portion I've sort of stubbed out in Azure SQL. And then I also have the bot service that's going to be talking to LUIS through that RESTful API that I talked about in order to determine intent. Once it actually understands the intent, and I know what the user's trying to do, then I can go call out to Azure Logic Apps, and then it's going to fulfill those requests. So let's get into a demo here. So now I am in Skype. This is just the web version of Skype. I've got my bot here, and I can go ahead and just issue commands like, what is the weather today? It basically says, I don't understand, which is good because I haven't told it what that means. But if I want to go ahead and say, what is the price of ETH, which is basically the symbol for Ethereum, it's going to come back and say the last price was $313 Canadian, which really hurts. And then I can say, how much is Ethereum? So 313, that's a good sign. But then I can also change the question and say, how much does Bitcoin cost? So $3,217 Canadian. So I've phrased this question 3 different ways. And I haven't done any programming around that. But what LUIS has been able to do is understand my intent. The intent is, how much is the price of something? And it's detecting it multiple different ways. So we can also say, how many ETH do I have? And it should be able to get my position. So it's saying I currently have fictitiously 163 coins. I can also say, number of BTC. and it's saying I have 272 Bitcoins. So once again, I can ask the question many different ways. But what if I want to go ahead and buy? So let's say I want to buy, to buy 30 ETH at whatever it was, say 320. Right, so it's understood that intent that I now want to buy. So then Gordon Gekko, he's applauding, saying, let's go make some money. Now, I can also say, sir, please purchase 30 Ethereum. Let's go Bitcoin. For 3,200, that would be super lovely. So now it's interpreted that even though I've asked the question a different way. So lastly, I can say the market is dumping. Let's dump 10 ETH at so now it's detected that I've wanted to sell something, so it's gone ahead and called upon that action. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to move on and show you a little bit more about Lewis. So within Lewis, so it's lewis.ai, there's basically some free entitlements, so you can go ahead and try this for free. And what I've gone ahead is I've established these different intents. So I can buy a coin, I can get a coin price, I can get the number of coins, I can have none, which is why when I said, like, what is the weather, it interpreted that as none of these other ones, so it must be none. And then sell coin. As part of that, I then identify entities, essentially nouns. So I would have an amount that I'm interested, I would have a coin or coin type, so Bitcoin or Ethereum, and then I would have a price related to that. So then when I go into intents, and I can say buy a coin, I can now start to type, I would like to buy, say 30 BTC at whatever, 3,300 bucks, and hit enter. And then what it's done, or it is loading, but what it's gone ahead is essentially sort of parse that, and it's able to determine that I've asked for an amount, I've asked for a coin, and I've asked for a price. So these are all of the different ways you can ask the questions, and what happens is the more you throw at this, and the more you correct it, the more it learns. And I can go ahead and test this by using this console, and this can be either sort of the untrained model or the untrained model or the published model. And I can go ahead and say here, like how much is Bitcoin? And then what will happen here is it'll come back and say, I've detected that your intent is the price of Bitcoin, and I've detected that the coin type is coin. So it seems like it's having a bit of an issue here. So I'm just going to move on. Next, once I'm happy with it, I can go ahead and publish it, and I do have this endpoint. And basically, I can take this endpoint, I can go into Postman, I can issue my own commands, and basically come up with sort of common sayings that are sort of related, and then actually go back in to the model itself, and I can look at suggested utterances, and if there's sort of phrases that haven't been caught, I can then go ahead and reassign it to the different intents, train the model, publish it, and actually then going forward, it'll now understand. So it's not pure magic, but it is pretty awesome. And I think initially you're kind of like, why is it only detecting 50%? But you do need to spend some time feeding and carrying this. And then what you can actually go ahead and see that now it's very accurate. So when I'm going through a lot of this stuff, it'll be like 99% confident that it understands the intent and it understands the different entities. So that's Lewis AI. So just now in summary, so leverage platform as a service to accelerate delivery and reduce your costs. And I think analytics very much aligns to this model. And I think back to the earlier slide where I talk about platforms, really this is sort of the point that I'm trying to get after, is actually go ahead and be that superhero. And actually you can do so without a whole lot of heavy lifting. I think part of it is just having an open perspective and being willing to sort of look at these new services that are available. And what's interesting is a lot of the stuff you can do on a coffee budget. Like for the amount that it costs to go to a Starbucks and get a latte every day, you're actually able to use some pretty cutting edge stuff. And kind of the way I've been positioning this at where I work is this idea of getting on a treadmill. You know, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, they've democratized a lot of this stuff, especially in AI. Every company, whether you're a 10-person startup or Fortune 500, you have access to these same tool sets. So this whole idea that, you know, these incumbents that have been around for 100 years have an advantage is a bit of a myth in my mind. I think the companies that are going to be successful in the next 5 years are the people that can actually adopt this new technology and actually keep adopting it without a whole lot of friction. The other thing is our workforce is changing. You know, you always hear the difference of the millennials. They come into some of these organizations and go, use what? Like, this is, you know, they're used to some very modern tools that are very responsive. And also, I would say the future is not as far away as you think. I wouldn't have guessed a year ago that I'd be doing something like this today. So, you know, don't just say, oh, this is like, you know, science fiction. Like, this is becoming real, and there's organizations that are really betting big on this in order to drive competitive advantage. So with that, I'll close. Feel free, I'm here for the rest of the event, so feel free to pull me aside if you have any questions. Thanks.